Hi everyone, and welcome to our Week 4 lecture on J.M. Coetzee's novella Waiting for the Barbarians. I'll begin this week by offering some biographical information about Coetzee. Then, to situate the novel in its context and to sort of anchor our discussion, I'll give a chronology of the history of South Africa. And then I'll conclude by discussing a couple of issues in the novel itself that you might want to think about as you read. J.M., which is short for John Maxwell Coetzee, was born in 1940 and raised in Cape Town, South Africa, in an Afrikaner family, which essentially means that he's of Dutch colonial descent. As an adult, he lived for a time both in the UK and the US before returning to the University of Cape Town to teach. He now lives in Australia and works primarily on animal rights activism in addition to his writing. He has twice won the Booker Prize, and in 2003 he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Coetzee's work has always been brutally critical of the system of apartheid and of the difficulty and inequity of race relations in South Africa, both of which are legacies of the history of imperialism in the country, a history which I'll detail for you in a minute. When accepting a literary prize in 1987, Coetzee argued that the structures of South African society had resulted in, quote, deformed and stunted relations between human beings and a, quote, deformed and stunted inner life. South African literature, he said, quote, is a literature in bondage. It is a less than fully human literature. It is exactly the kind of literature you would expect people to write from prison. These sentiments, I think, have obvious resonances with our novel, Waiting for the Barbarians, which was published just a few years earlier in 1980. Now, to situate the novel in context and to anchor our discussion, I'll now offer a brief chronology of the history of South Africa, starting with the colonial era. The area was initially established as a trading outpost by the Dutch East India Company in 1652 and was gradually populated by settlers from the Netherlands, who also brought in slave labor from countries like India and Indonesia, as well as by a few French refugees and Germans in the employ of the company. The combination of these Northern European emigrants produced a distinct ethnic group, now known in South Africa as the Afrikaners, which developed its own language called Afrikaans. The British also moved into the area in the early 19th century, leaving the Cape divided between British and Afrikaner settlements and indigenous Xhosa and Zulu principalities. Both colonial powers engaged in frontier wars with the natives throughout the 19th century, which resulted in the mass takeover of local territory and the incorporation of most of the area's indigenous people. As natural resources like diamonds and gold were discovered in the region, the so-called Mineral Revolution, the British began to increase their military pressure on the Dutch, hoping to take over the entire Cape. This conflict culminated in the British victory in the Boer War at the end of the 19th century, after which South Africa was consolidated under British control. One of the first measures passed by the new parliament was the Natives' Land Act of 1913, which essentially institutionalized the system of segregation that had already developed in the area between blacks and whites, and it legally restricted black ownership of land to 7% of the country, a law that incredibly stayed on the books until the 1990s after the fall of apartheid. In 1931, South Africa was granted independence from the UK, and in 1948, the National Party, a hardline conservative party of Afrikaner nationalists, was elected to power. Apartheid, which is the Afrikaner word for apartness, was established by the National Party after its election in 1948, and it continued in South Africa until 1994. Put simply, apartheid legislated absolute racial segregation and permanently enfranchised white minority rule. First, the Population Registration Act of 1950 classed everyone in the country according to 4 distinct racial groups: white, black, colored, or mixed race, and Indian, and that was primarily the descendants of slaves and indentured servants. Then the Group Areas Act, which was also passed in 1950, physically restructured the country along these racial lines. Non-whites were forcibly evicted from desirable areas, and black South Africans were moved into so-called townships, which are basically overcrowded, impoverished, makeshift shanty towns on the outskirts of South African cities. Most black South Africans still live in these areas and under these conditions even today. The pass laws that followed required the black population to carry identity cards and passbooks around with them when outside their designated racial area. And any white person, even a child, could demand that a black person produce his or her pass at any time. Without valid proof of entry, one could be arrested and imprisoned and perhaps even disappeared. Many black South Africans were taken by the police during this period and were never heard from again. Other laws passed around the same time barred blacks from practicing skilled trades, prescribed that only whites could be employers, prohibited mixed marriage on the grounds of immorality, and segregated education, among other things. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 established a system of so-called petty apartheid that propped up these grander structural laws. Anytime racial groups had to be in proximity, special facilities were reserved for whites. This included things like bathrooms, drinking fountains, benches, buses, beaches, cinemas, hospitals, graveyards, and so on and so forth. Now, remarkably, as I mentioned, apartheid persisted until 1994, when South Africa finally held its first election with universal suffrage, and the ANC, or the African National Congress, was elected with Nelson Mandela, a former political prisoner, at its helm. Now, just a little bit about resistance to and the dissolution of apartheid so we can sort of track this history a bit. Of course, apartheid faced almost immediate resistance from the black community. Most early protests agitating for black South African rights were spearheaded by the ANC, which focused on organizing strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience actions. However, some of these demonstrations ended in violent clashes with the police and mass killings of protesters. In response, the government legislated emergency powers, which gave the police nearly unlimited license to detain and imprison members of the black civil rights movement. Following this development, the ANC formed a military wing called Umkhonto we Sizwe for the purposes of armed struggle, and it began to carry out acts of sabotage against state structures throughout the 1960s. Nelson Mandela and the other ANC leaders were found guilty of terrorism and guerrilla warfare charges in 1964 and were sentenced to life imprisonment. The 1970s saw the development of the Black Consciousness movement, which was inspired by Black Power in the U.S., which organized student and labor protests and uprisings, many of which were headed by charismatic leader Steve Biko. Shortly after the 1976 Soweto uprising, which was a rally against the forced use of English and Afrikaans in black schools in South Africa, Biko was taken into custody and tortured by security personnel, and he died 3 days later. A state of emergency was again declared for much of the 1980s, and violent protests in the black townships continued unabated. Waiting for the Barbarians was published in 1980, so this is basically Coetzee's immediate context, what he's immediately writing back to and writing into. Now, in terms of external pressure on the apartheid system, from the 1960s onward, the UN encouraged economic and trade sanctions against South Africa, and many states also engaged in cultural and sporting boycotts of the country. By the late 1970s, the South African economy had grown sluggish as these sanctions left the country isolated and underdeveloped. This combination of external and internal pressures finally led to the dismantling of apartheid under President F.W. de Klerk in a series of negotiations between 1990 and 1993, which included the release of Nelson Mandela from jail in 1990. A multiracial transitional government was established, a new constitution was developed, and in 1994, South Africa's first free and fair election brought the ANC to power as the country's ruling party. Since the end of apartheid, many positive changes have occurred in South Africa, some coming through the provisions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but many problems remain. Residential racial segregation and serious economic disparities between black and white South Africans are prevalent even today, and the country has one of the highest rates of violent crime in the world. As these issues suggest, once empire is in, it can't be undone, and the reverberations of racial power structures established centuries ago and carried through 50 years of internal colonialism are not easily quieted. Now, in terms of the novel's relationship to its surrounding context, Coetzee's empire, of course, goes unnamed in the novel. In fact, we have little sense of place or time in Waiting for the Barbarians, and we might think a bit more about why this is the case. Nevertheless, Coetzee clearly has some elements of South African society on his mind as he writes. One major theme in the novel that speaks to Coetzee's immediate context is that of torture and the body in pain. On page 115 of the book, the magistrate talks about being reduced to, quote, living as a body. In other words, to what theorist Giorgio Agamben calls zoe, or bare life, as opposed to bios, which is politically or morally qualified life, the life of the citizen. Zoe is what human life is reduced to without the rights of the citizen, as under an authoritarian regime, or as in the moment of torture, when the individual is subject to what Michel Foucault calls biopower, the power of the state exercised over the physical body. Zoe is also the necessary negative referent by which power relations demarcate what constitutes legal life, life that matters. It's a kind of animal life, which is what the magistrate is reduced to in this moment, like the barbarians before him. A bare, merely biological existence reduced to the body's rudimentary needs. Critic Elaine Scarry's book, The Body in Pain, takes up a similar theme. It talks about the capacity of torturers to, quote, unmake the worlds of their victims by gradually reducing them to a state in which they are unable to speak, experience, or imagine any reality outside their pain. The body in pain becomes the full extent of one's existence when one is being tortured, a space in which one's absolute vulnerability is exposed and preyed upon. The rest of the world melts away, as we see with the magistrate in this scene. So the individual body is a crucial tool of the colonial state, and likewise of the internal colonialism of the apartheid state. It is here, therefore, that we see the novel most explicitly reflecting its contemporary context. Indeed, Coetzee has said in his 1986 essay, Into the Dark Chamber, which I've posted to our website in case you're interested in reading it, that, quote, in South Africa it is not possible to deny the authority of suffering and therefore of the body. And he seems to be referring here both to torture, as with Steve Biko's murder by security forces, and to things like day-to-day dehumanization, poverty, and so on. A great many people's worlds were reduced to the body's rudimentary needs in apartheid-era South Africa, and a black body in particular meant absolute liability and absolute vulnerability. In the article, Coetzee writes, quote, torture has exerted a dark fascination on many South African writers. Why should this be so? There are, it seems to me, two reasons. The first is that relations in the torture room provide a metaphor, bare and extreme, for relations between authoritarianism and its victims. In the torture room, unlimited force is exerted upon the physical being of an individual in a twilight of legal illegality, with the purpose, if not of destroying him, then at least of destroying the kernel of resistance within him. In other words, torture seems to Coetzee to be a distillation of broader relationships between colonizer and colonized, and between white and black communities in apartheid-era South Africa. Another issue I'd like you to consider as you read is that of othering. Now, othering is defined by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffins, and Helen Tiffin in their book Postcolonial Studies, The Key Concepts, as the way in which imperial discourse ensures the binary separation of the colonizer and the colonized, and asserts the primacy of the colonizing culture and worldview. The other is therefore the excluded or mastered subject created by the discourse of power. However, Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin also point out that the self, in this case the empire, needs to construct its others, at least in part, in order to confirm its own reality. In other words, the somewhat muddy idea of who and what we are can be clarified by defining ourselves as everything they are not. In the case of the novel, if the empire says that the barbarians are uncivilized, dirty, disorderly, and ignorant, then by implication the empire itself is civilized, clean, orderly, and educated. Of course, whether the empire actually exhibits any of these traits in the novel is certainly debatable, and this is a point we'll talk about further during this week's e-discussion. I'll also be interested in hearing how you think othering operates in both the C.P. Cavafy poem that I've posted to our website, from which Coetzee's novel takes its title, and in Said's Orientalism essay. How do these three texts take up the concept of othering, do you think? So what to do now? Well, first, carry on reading the novel, along with the Cavafy poem, which is posted under this unit's module page, and the Said essay, which is a downloadable file also posted to our Race and Empire module page, and respond to our week's e-discussion questions as you go. If you have any extra time this week, you might consider getting a head start on Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which will be starting in on 2 weeks from now. In any case, I hope you enjoy Waiting for the Barbarians, and I'll look forward to our e-discussion conversations this week.